Ladies and gentlemen, please, with a round of applause, welcome to the stage Dr. Martha Tesfaye Woldemichael from the IMF.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking Softlogic Stockbrokers for the invitation to speak today. It is a privilege to address you all today because we are at an important juncture in Sri Lanka's economic journey. I also want to acknowledge the significance of this moment. As you may know, just last week, our IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, concluded her very first official visit to Sri Lanka. She came to witness the country's progress firsthand, to stand in solidarity with communities still recovering from Cyclone Ditwa, and to reaffirm the IMF's commitment to support Sri Lanka as the country undertakes recovery and reconstruction efforts. So let me start by talking a bit about Sri Lanka's economic journey, which is quite striking. So since independence, the country's economic growth trajectory has not been a smooth upward slope, right? It has been a series of recoveries interrupted by shocks, both domestic and external. A civil conflict that lasted almost 3 decades, weighed heavily on investment and social cohesion. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami claimed tens of thousands of lives and caused extensive economic losses. And then the Easter Sunday terrorist attacks of 2019 devastated tourism and consumer confidence. The pandemic then brought the global economy to its knees, and Sri Lanka, unfortunately, was no exception. Yet, none of these events fully prepared the country for what came in 2022. A combination of policy mistakes and shocks, external shocks, culminated in Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis since independence. Inflation surged to almost 70%. International reserves were depleted. The country defaulted on its external debt, and millions of families saw their living standards fall sharply. And then, in late November 2025, as the economy was beginning to breathe again, Cyclone Ditwa struck. It was among the most destructive natural disasters in Sri Lanka's recent history, causing severe flooding and landslides in a matter of days. Over 600 people lost their lives, more than 200,000 were displaced, and some 2.3 million people were directly affected across all districts on the island. The cyclone also destroyed critical infrastructure and devastated livelihoods. This is a stark reminder of Sri Lanka's really fragile recovery. So after the economic crisis hit, Sri Lanka turned to the IMF to seek financial assistance and policy advice in order to chart a path back to stability. And in March 23, the executive board of the IMF approved a 4-year extended fund facility arrangement worth approximately $3 billion. The program, as you may know, is built around several core pillars. It focuses on restoring fiscal and debt sustainability while protecting the vulnerable. It focuses on keeping inflation in check, safeguarding financial sector stability, rebuilding external buffers, strengthening governance, but also advancing growth-enhancing structural reforms. All of these are not independent objectives. They are mutually reinforcing. For instance, you cannot have durable growth without any fiscal credibility. Similarly, you cannot have social acceptance of reforms without protecting those who can least afford to bear its costs. So far, 4 reviews out of 8 have been completed under the EFF, and the program has disbursed close to $1.74 billion. And Sri Lanka's economic reform program has also been delivering tangible results. If you look at inflation, it fell to 2.3% year on year in January 25. Reserves stood at $6.8 billion at the end of last year. And real GDP, which had contracted by an average of 4.8% in 22-23, actually grew by plus 5% in 2024. Revenue mobilization also improved significantly, with tax revenue rising from 7.3% of GDP in 22 to 12.4% in 24. And as you know, debt restructuring is almost complete, and this would place public debt on a path towards sustainability. Sri Lanka also took major steps to strengthen governance and advance its anti-corruption agenda. Important milestones were achieved by enacting key legislation for safeguarding the independence of the central bank, improving public financial management, improving public debt management, and strengthening the legal framework for anti-corruption. And as you may know, in 23, Sri Lanka also became the first country in Asia to undergo an IMF governance diagnostic assessment. This assessment is a comprehensive evaluation of governance weaknesses and corruption vulnerabilities across public institutions. So it really takes political courage for the authorities to request such an assessment from the IMF. It also signals to investors that the government is serious about transparency and accountability. But beyond financial support, the IMF also provides technical assistance and training that often receives less attention, but that it matters enormously as well for the country. So we work alongside the central bank on monetary policy frameworks, macro modeling. We support the Minister of Finance on revenue administration and public financial management. We also provide capacity development on anti-money laundering frameworks. These are not peripheral activities. They really help build the institutional muscle that sustains reforms long after any program concludes. So last week, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva described Sri Lanka's performance under the program as a success story. So this reflects a genuine recognition of what the country has accomplished so far. But a success story is not a finished story, right? Sri Lanka still faces significant hurdles on the road ahead. We know that the country is operating in a challenging global environment, marked by significant uncertainty from trade tensions and geopolitical conflicts as well. Economic fragmentation is creating risks for small, open economies like Sri Lanka that depend on access to global markets, and this leaves key export sectors such as garment exposed to disruption. And as Cyclone Ditwa recently showed, Sri Lanka is also vulnerable to natural disasters. While the occurrence of external shocks is beyond the control of the government, their impact can be mitigated by strengthening the resilience of the economy. Sri Lanka can build resilience to climate shocks by developing early warning systems, disaster-resilient infrastructure, climate-smart agriculture, and better land use planning. And resilience to economic shocks, as our managing director stressed during her visit last week, comes from keeping one's house in order. And what does that mean? It means rebuilding fiscal and external buffers to make sure that the country has the policy space it needs to respond to shocks when they happen. The cyclone itself illustrated this point. When Ditwa struck, the government was able to respond quickly by deploying emergency disaster relief, and this was supported by the strong fiscal performance in 2024 and 2025. So this is really what buffers buy you. Buffers buy the ability to absorb shocks swiftly without abandoning the reform path. And countries that face a crisis with strong reserves Sufficient fiscal space and credible policy frameworks are on a better footing to recover faster and more inclusively than those that do not. This is why the key message here, staying the course on reforms, is so important. Sri Lanka's recovery is still fragile, so sustaining the reform momentum will put Sri Lanka on a firmer footing to weather any future shock and also to achieve strong, durable, and inclusive growth. In this context, it is really important for Sri Lanka to safeguard the hard-won macroeconomic stability by sustaining efforts to raise domestic revenue in a way that is fair, transparent, and efficient. It is also important to preserve cost recovery energy pricing to minimize fiscal risks to the budget, promote sound debt management practices to avoid debt building up again, and also accumulating international reserves to restore market confidence. Sri Lanka should also safeguard financial stability and stay committed to price stability by refraining from monetary financing and upholding central bank independence. At the same time, corruption vulnerabilities need to be tackled. And this is to prevent revenue leakages and also create a conducive business climate. Tax incentives should be granted in limited, well-defined cases based on transparent and rule-based frameworks. Throughout all of this, protecting the poor, protecting the vulnerable is a prerequisite for reforms to be socially acceptable and politically sustainable. It is crucial for the government to sustain social protection reforms to shield vulnerable households from the impact of shocks and policy adjustments. Programs like Aswesuma, for instance, should be adequately targeted, adequately funded, and this will ensure that the benefits of these reforms reach all Sri Lankans. This imperative has grown more urgent in the wake of the cyclone, which has put 10% of the population at risk of falling below the poverty line. While safeguarding macro stability is necessary, it's not sufficient. The task ahead is really to move from stabilization to transformation. So what does this transformation look like in practice? Transformation means pressing ahead on trade liberalization, reducing tariff barriers, streamlining customs procedures, integrating more deeply into regional and global supply chains, including through trade agreements, so that Sri Lankan firms can access the markets and inputs they need to grow and to compete. Transformation also means accelerating digitalization in tax administration, in public services, in the financial sector, and across the economy, in order to improve efficiency, to reduce corruption vulnerabilities, and also to open new avenues for innovation. Transformation also means labor market reforms that increase flexibility, productivity, and expand female labor force participation, which remains far below its potential and represents one of the most significant untapped drivers of growth in this economy. Transformation means also investing in infrastructure connectivity across the island. It means building on Sri Lanka's extraordinary natural advantages as a tourism destination by investing in quality, sustainability, and also regional connectivity. It means creating the conditions that attract foreign direct investment through a stable regulatory environment and a predictable framework for doing business. Staying the course on this agenda matters significantly for investor confidence. When a government demonstrates policy continuity, when it meets program targets, when it completes reviews, when it does what it says it will do, it builds something that cannot be manufactured overnight. It builds track record. And track record is the foundation on which investors make decisions. Every structural benchmark met under the EFF program, every review successfully concluded, and every governance reform successfully implemented is a signal to investors and markets around the world that Sri Lanka is a serious, reliable partner for investment. Which brings me also to you, investors, entrepreneurs in this room, in a context where you have public resources that are scarce and fiscal space that is limited, constrained. The private sector has a critical role to play in supporting economic recovery for Sri Lanka by creating jobs, by generating innovation, by driving long-term growth. You can help translate this macroeconomic stability into lasting improvements in living standards for all Sri Lankans. So let me just close where I began. Sri Lanka has demonstrated remarkable recovery from the crisis thanks to bold reforms and the sacrifices and commitments of the Sri Lankan people. Even in the aftermath of Ditwa, we see something that gives genuine confidence, really a government that responded swiftly to the shock, an international community that mobilized very quickly, and people that, in the words of our managing director, come together and think about the future, even in the most painful moments. The path ahead requires continued discipline, continued reform, continued engagement between the government and the private sector, continued solidarity between Sri Lanka and its international partners. And it also requires that the benefits of growth reach every corner of the country. The IMF remains a steadfast partner in this journey, and we are committed to helping Sri Lanka turn the recovery into a lasting prosperity. Thank you for your attention.
Please join me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Talal Rafi.
Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, my thanks to Softlogic Stockbrokers. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to speak here. So I'm going to divide my talk into a bit. I'll start off with the current situation, and then I'll go into some of the opportunities, then on whether the economic recovery is sustainable, then the macroeconomic risks. And I'll finally end with a future outlook, just a couple of indicators. So as we start, we know how Sri Lanka was in a crisis. 2022 to 2024 was a period of stabilization. And 2025 and now onwards, we need to shift into a growth mode. So that is, the biggest question is, how do we transform from stabilization to growth? Of course, when you switch to growth, that doesn't mean that you don't have stabilization. Of course, there cannot be long-term growth without stability. So always fiscal and monetary policy stability is absolutely essential. So currently, inflation back to normal, expect to hit a target of 5% by the second half of this year. Exchange rate largely stabilized, and public debt to GDP has declined from a high of 128% to hitting around the 100 mark. Gross financing needs, which is absolutely essential, from almost 34%, we've come to the 20% mark. And interest to revenue from around 80% to 50%. So these are all great achievements. I mean, credit goes to the previous government and the present government following this path. And growth, according to the IMF, is expected to be 2.9% and next year 3.1%. So though the central bank is more optimistic. And right, I would say that the current path we are taking is good for us in the long term because there's a heavy focus on fiscal and monetary discipline. So this is something that comes positive out of the crisis we've been to. And this can set the stage for Sri Lanka for the future. So I'll just touch briefly on Cyclone Ditwa. So the damage, as you know, according to the World Bank, is at around $4 billion, though the reconstruction, the opportunity cost can be much higher. So the estimate is not yet out. And agriculture being hit, the trade deficit can also widen with larger imports needed. And according to the IMF, around $700 million hit on the current account. So these are factors that have to be taken into account. And regarding the debt update, first of all, I mean, defaulting is not the end of the world. There are many countries that have gone through these cycles and come out much better. If you take, for example, Spain defaulted 13 times between 1500 and 1900. Argentina 3 times after in the 21st century. Of course, Argentina is not a good example, but India is one of the best, we can say. Though India didn't default, it came very close to it. So always coming close to default, or in the case of Sri Lanka's default, in my view is good because it awakens people. I mean, we start looking at every factors very carefully. You can see that in the previous government and this government, they're very, very focused on the fiscal side, almost fearing anything that could go wrong with it. So those are some of the factors. So currently, right now, we are paying interest on both commercial and bilateral debt. So multilateral debt, as we know, of course, the World Bank, ADB leading it, it is being serviced, but at the same time, we continue to borrow, though we haven't borrowed on the bilateral front. So in 2028, we will just be starting to repay bilateral debt. So it's going to be an increase of around $1 billion, additional to what we are doing right now. So, but the reserve projections, targets, that's where the focus should be. By the end of this year, currently we are at $6.8 billion. We should be, by the end of this year, 8.8 billion. I mean, though this is not a conditionality, it's just a projection. And by the end of next year, 2027, $13.4 billion. So between January and December of 2027, we need to increase reserves by $4.7 billion. And 2028, 15.7 billion. So there is another increase needed of $2.3 billion. So these are critical questions. So, and if you see the latest report by the IMF, we are projected, and not a conditionality, projected to issue sovereign bonds of $1.5 billion in 2027 and 2028. So that is something that has to be taken into consideration with credit ratings and others. So coming on to the next stage, whether economic recovery, is it sustainable? I mean, I would say depending on 3 factors. The first, fiscal discipline. So revenue mobilization, that's always going to be a challenge. I mean, after next year, I don't know how much we could get out of vehicles. Tariffs that I would like to put it to. Domestic and external shocks. I mean, I'll touch on that later, but they can come in varying forms. Election cycles. So this is one of the risks that is placed by the IMF report itself. And then the second point is external sector stability. So export diversification, that is needed, dependent on these things. If you see credit ratings for developing and emerging markets, one of the critical factors is the economy is not diverse enough. So the fact that we need to diversify is essential. Tourism recovery, that is needed. Of course, we are having record numbers, but we need to sustain that. And the need for tradable sector growth. So when we speak about economic growth, I sometimes always say that the better way to look at it is how much is our tradable sector growing, because that's important. Between 2010 and 2015, our economy grew by a lot, but the growth was largely non-tradable sectors, while we were borrowing in foreign exchange. So herein lies the problem. So even when I was recently giving a speech in Nepal, and they were talking about borrowing at a larger scale, so I told them that whatever you're borrowing in foreign currency, make sure it has to be something that brings in foreign currency. So that is a critical factor. And the third thing, whether it's sustainable, is productivity and investment. So here, currently, recovery is largely consumption-based. So we have to move towards a growth of productivity increase, technology infusion, and infrastructure. So just to give an example, if you look at China, between the year 1980 and 2020, China showed, record-breaking growth, almost double digits. It's not, it'll always be a miracle how it happened for such a large country to grow. But if you see China's growth, almost half of that growth came from productivity increase. A large number of people moving from the agricultural sector to the industries, from the rural areas to the cities, and upskilling and other factors. So this is where we need to get the growth on. So coming on to opportunities. Currently, this is also a work that I'm doing for the EU. So opportunities, I always see renewable energy as number one for me. The reason is, if you look at the latest UN report, it shows that around 20% of global investments is going into data centers. So data centers is everywhere. I mean, France is getting the most investments, but India also. And the factor here is that you need to produce electricity to sustain that. The current data centers around the world consume the power of France as a country, but that is rapidly growing up. So two factors that are going to be positive. One is there's always going to be demand. The other thing is electricity prices or energy prices will keep going up. So anyway, it's going to be a profitable thing. And of course, for us, with the potential we have, this is definitely the area. And we have a very power-hungry, energy-hungry India to the north. And as the former president said, Prime Minister Modi had told him, whatever energy you can send, we are ready to buy. So this is definitely a market where we need to go forward, and it can go forward as long as the correct policies are in place. Logistics and shipping, this is another key area, especially among the European investors, keen interest on these areas. We sit on one of the busiest shipping lines in the world. And we always talk of Dubai or Singapore, but even if you look at the example of Netherlands, they developed because of shipping and logistics. So this is another key area. Tourism, Sri Lanka has the brand. A bit more spending into capacity and infrastructure will help us a long way in this area. And just to touch on tourism, I mean, I've said this before, many people show the path towards growth, but growth doesn't necessarily have to come from industrializing. Countries such as Spain developed, I mean, they never industrialized really to a large extent. It's largely based on tourism, it sustains. It has the second largest amount of tourists coming in, Spain. And if you look at Maldives and other countries. So there are other ways to go through it. And the next is services, IT BPM sector. That is definitely an area. We have the human capital, and it needs little imports. And as far as whether we should go into manufacturing or services, I've always said this, services has a better this thing, because one, the reason is the global markets have changed. I mean, the growth model that economists talk about is Vietnam, China, or South Korea, Taiwan. But those stages of the world, I mean, it was different. When Japan and South Korea and others were developing, the US was there to support them because of the Cold War. And then in the 1980s, China and Vietnam got on the bandwagon with the globalization, which we largely missed out of. And Southeast Asian countries have got into that. So here again, right now, I don't know how far we can go into manufacturing because of the aging population. And as you know, we have a global climate where the country that bore the brunt of trade was the US. And now they have a president who is trying to roll that back. So unless with the US cutting down on its over $1 trillion deficit, many other countries would be cutting down. So that path comes down. And lastly, opportunity is integration with India. So that is always, I've said, South India is growing rapidly. I mean, it's going to be the southern states itself come to over $1 trillion. Even if you take the state of Tamil Nadu, by 2034, it's going to be $1 trillion economy. So therein lies a great opportunity for Sri Lanka. And coming on to the macro risks As I mentioned before, fiscal slippage, that's the factor. Reform fatigue. So I can understand Sri Lanka because of the program, strict fiscal discipline. Businesses are finding it a little bit hard, but the reforms have to go through. I mean, fatigue always sets in. Social pressure, the ending of the IMF program by next year, that always makes governments a little bit less disciplined. External financing is the second area of risks. The first thing is, of course, in a scenario, Sri Lankan government or Sri Lanka as a nation could do no wrong, but there are triggers. I'll give you a few examples. So if you look at countries, of course, these countries have had very large structural issues, but the triggers have always been things which are out of their control. For example, Mexico. From 1983 to 1994, they had primary surpluses. Everything was stable. But then it only took 6 months for them to come close to default. And the reason was because the US increased interest rates. So it has an effect. The second thing is, of course, Argentina in 2001. And one of the triggers, of course, Argentina has a lot of structural issues, but the trigger was Brazil devaluing its currency. So that triggered it. Asian financial crisis, Thailand. So that has a contagion effect on the rest of the region, and which eventually next year caused Russia to go into a crisis, economic crisis. And lastly, India. Of course, in 1991, India had a closed economy and issues, but then the trigger was Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. So there could be external factors, so as far as the macroeconomic risks are concerned. So global borrowing costs going up is one thing. I mean, the new Fed chair, he believes that interest rates could be brought down, but at the same time, inflation could also be down. And the argument is that AI will cause a productivity increase. But then if you look at the 1990s, this was an argument used by back then the Fed chair, saying that the information technology revolution would increase productivity, but that didn't go well. In the 1990s, we later saw inflation hitting there. So these are concerns on the risk side. Slowest global economic growth in decades we are seeing. So of course, as you know, with the president, with the tariffs, so there's a lot of uncertainty. So those are things to be considered. China's trade surplus, that is another factor. If you look at the IMF managing director speaking, she was stating that China's economy, the consumption is not picking up because of many factors, including slump in their real estate sector. So what that means is China is heavily dependent on exports. And for a very large economy like China, almost a $20 trillion economy, it is, I mean, it's common sense, it's not sustainable to go entirely on exports. They have to switch to consumption. So how the Chinese government does that is going to be a challenge. The other challenge is also, it means trade is going to be cut. I mean, when you have such a large surplus, of course, China is looking to other markets to send their products into. Volatile commodity markets, of course, as you know, right now as we speak, the US president has given a deadline for possible attacks on Iran. So the repercussions could be severe. So these are some of the factors. Political risk, that is another factor in my own personal view. Elections, populist promises. So this has been, if you look at from the beginning of times, I mean, from the 1950s, this is one of the reasons why we have always, like Martha said, gone in a cycle. It's recovery, growth, and then growth pauses for a while. So one of the reasons is, of course, the election cycles. And lastly, the risk could be stabilization without productivity growth. So right now we have stabilization, in my view. Things are fine, inflation, everything is stable, but are we increasing productivity? So that's the main question we need to know. I mean, stabilization without productivity growth will not bode well in the long term. And just to finish off my talk, but on the positive side, my personal view is that Sri Lanka, in my word, is a gold mine, especially for investors. because there's a huge amount of potential, especially with the location, human capital. There's a very large, the fastest growing G20 economy in the north of us. But the positive part about this is that we could easily reach 7% growth, but the factor holding us back is structural reforms, which as a nation we can implement. As Martha mentioned, trade is one factor. As far as I'm concerned, that is the most critical factor. I've said this, before. If you look at India in 91, China in 78, Vietnam in 86, there were many factors, of course. It wasn't the only thing, but the one factor that changed them was a change of trade and investment policies. That is what transformed them. If you study them, it's nothing else. It's not that corruption went down or corruption went up or other factors. Those all play a part, but it's, at the end, even if you leave investment, it's just trade. You open up the economy becomes competitive. And only the fittest survive, like the theory of evolution. So when the fittest survive, the economy is much stronger. So I don't have time to go into that area, but as a whole, I would say other reforms are SOE reforms, regulatory reforms, land, labor. If all these factors are this thing, we can easily tap into our potential. And lastly, forward outlook, two factors I would really keep an eye on would be the primary balance, and the second factor would be reserve accumulation. So with those two factors, if they are kept within the limits, I think Sri Lanka has a great future ahead of us. With this, I'll once again thank Softlogic Stockbrokers for inviting me. Thank you very much.